I'm sorry, sir. Dogs aren't allowed in here. The words were cold, but his answer was calm. It's not a pet. It's my service dog. He helps me find my way. And yet, they still asked him to leave. A veteran, a man who had given everything now, turned away with nothing but dignity and a quiet dog at his side. But the night wasn't done with him yet. 15 minutes later, military SUVs pulled in one by one, engines low and deliberate. They filled every space in the diner's lot, and every heart on that street skipped a beat. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The rain that evening came down in steady sheets, turning the sidewalks into slick rivers and washing the city in a dull, silver glow. Harbor View Diner, with its neon sign flickering in the storm, stood out like a promise of warmth against the wet chill of San Francisco. Inside, the few customers huddled in booths, their conversations muted under the soft hum of the old jukebox and the hiss of the coffee machines. Jacob Turner pushed open the door, the bell above it jangling softly. He paused just inside the entrance, shoulders squared, a gloved hand resting on the back of his Labrador. Riley. The dog stood close, his golden coat glistening with rain, head up, eyes steady. They moved together with the quiet confidence of those who had walked harder roads than these. The diner's warmth wrapped around them, a sharp contrast to the bitter night outside. Jacob took a slow breath, scanning the room. A few heads turned, some faces flickering with recognition, others with polite indifference. He didn't mind. He wasn't here to make a scene. He guided Riley toward an empty booth near the window, the dog's paws silent on the worn linoleum. As he sat, he gently tugged off his damp gloves, folding them neatly on the edge of the table. Riley settled at his feet, head resting on crossed paws, ears flicking back at every new sound, but never moving from Jacob's side. A young waitress with tired eyes and a name tag reading Cassie approached, pad in hand. She offered a quick smile, polite but distant. "Can I get you something, sir?" she asked, her pen already hovering above the paper. Jacob met her eyes and returned the smile, a quiet one that didn't quite reach the corners of his mouth. "Just coffee for now." "Thank you," he said, his voice even and calm. Cassie nodded and turned away, and Jacob watched her go. He ran a hand through his short, graying hair, the motion more habit than necessity. A few booths over, Matthew Price nursed a late dinner, his fork paused halfway to his mouth. He watched the older man, something familiar tugging at the edge of his memory. The dog Riley looked up for a moment, meeting Matthew's gaze with calm, unblinking eyes before turning back to Jacob. The door to the kitchen swung open, and a man in a white apron emerged, his face pinched with impatience. He walked straight toward Jacob's table, Cassie trailing uncertainly behind him. The manager, his name was Jeff, spoke with the kind of forced politeness that carried a cold edge. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "We don't allow pets in here. You'll have to leave the dog outside." Jacob looked up, his brows knitting together just slightly. "He's not a pet," he said, his voice measured. "He's a service dog. I'm a veteran, and he's trained to help me." Riley's ears perked at the change in Jacob's tone, but he remained still. Jeff frowned, his eyes darting to Riley and back. "Do you have papers? A letter from your doctor or something to prove that?" he asked, his tone sharp, eyes scanning the room as if to make sure the other customers were listening. Jacob's jaw tightened. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a worn wallet. "Under the ADA," he said softly. "I'm not required to show you that. My word should be enough." He kept his voice calm, but there was a weight to it, something that made Matthew's pulse quicken. Jeff shifted uncomfortably. A couple at the next booth stopped eating, their forks suspended midair. Cassie's eyes darted between the men, her hands twisting in her apron. "Look," Jeff said, his voice rising just a little. "I don't make the rules. If you can't show me the paperwork, I can't let you stay." Jacob paused, fingers tightening around his wallet. He let out a slow breath, then carefully placed the wallet back in his jacket. "I understand," he said finally. His voice was quiet, but in the silence that followed, it seemed to fill the whole diner. I don't want any trouble. He rose slowly, shoulders straight despite the slight stiffness in his movements. Riley stood too, moving with quiet obedience, his tail low but calm. Jacob looked around the diner once, his gaze meeting Matthew's for a heartbeat. There was no anger there, only a quiet sadness and a dignity that cut deeper than any sharp word. Matthew's chest tightened. He watched as Jacob turned to leave, Riley close at his side. The rain outside was still coming down hard, drumming against the windows in a relentless rhythm. As Jacob reached the door, he paused, glancing back at the small warmth of the diner. Then he pushed the door open, and the bell chimed softly behind him as he stepped back into the cold. Cassie moved to clear the table, her hands trembling slightly. I'm sorry, she whispered, but Jacob was already gone. The words fell into the silence like a stone sinking into water, unnoticed by most, but felt by those who cared to see. Matthew set down his fork, his appetite gone. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing in around him. He knew that man. He had seen his face somewhere before. A news article, maybe, or an old magazine cover. A story about a firefight in a far-off place. A soldier who had pulled his team out when no one else could. He leaned back in his seat, staring at the empty booth. Around him, the other diners went back to their meals, the spell of the moment broken. The jukebox crackled softly, an old country song spinning on vinyl, and the rain kept falling outside, steady and cold. But Matthew couldn't let it go. He turned his eyes back to the door, to the neon sign that flickered in the downpour. He thought of the way Jacob had held himself, the quiet strength in every line of his posture. And he knew, in that instant, that he couldn't just sit here and let the night swallow the man and his dog. Outside, Jacob Turner pulled the hood of his jacket tighter around his face. Riley stayed close, his head brushing Jacob's knee as they stepped out into the wet night. The wind cut through them, but Jacob didn't shiver. He'd faced worse storms than this. He didn't look back. He just kept walking, each step measured, each breath steady, the leash a quiet tether between them. Riley's tail wagged once, a small flicker of faith that even the rain couldn't wash away. Inside the diner, Matthew Price pushed his plate away and reached for his phone. His heart was pounding, a sudden, fierce rhythm that matched the rain on the glass. He knew what he had to do, and he knew exactly who he was going to call. Matthew watched the door of Harborview Diner swing shut, the small bell above it jingling one last time. He leaned back in his booth, his mind racing faster than he could control. The memory of Jacob's quiet dignity, the unwavering calm in his eyes, wouldn't let him sit still. He reached for his coffee cup, but his hand paused midair. In that moment, a memory tugged at the back of his mind, something he'd read long ago. He closed his eyes and he could see it clearly, a newspaper article with a black and white photo of Jacob Turner. It was about a rescue mission in the mountains of Afghanistan, about a soldier who had carried 3 wounded men on his back to safety. Matthew took a slow breath, his fingers tapping against the worn Formica table. The details came flooding back in fragments. Jacob's name had been a footnote in most papers, but Matthew had read it, really read it. He remembered the headline, "Quiet Hero Veteran Saves His Brothers in Arms." It was the kind of story that stuck with you, even if you didn't know why. He opened his eyes, the diner around him coming back into focus. Cassie moved quietly through the rows of booths, avoiding his gaze. Outside, the rain still poured down in relentless sheets, making the windows shiver with each gust of wind. Matthew knew what he had to do. He couldn't just sit here and watch a good man be turned away. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name he hadn't called in years. Scott Walters. Scott had been a colonel in the Army. Steady, dependable, the kind of man who knew how to get things done. Matthew hesitated only a second before hitting the call button. The phone rang once, twice, then connected. A familiar voice, deep and calm, came through the speaker. Scott Walters. It said. Matthew cleared his throat, his voice low. Scott, it's Matt Price. I need your help. There was a pause. Matt Scott sounded surprised, but not unwelcoming. It's been a while. What's going on? Matthew leaned forward, his elbows on the table. It's about a veteran named Jacob Turner, he said quickly. He was just turned away from Harborview Diner with his service dog. They're demanding papers he doesn't need to show. You know the law, and you know who he is. Scott didn't respond for a moment, but Matthew could hear the change in his breathing, a shift from casual to focused. Jacob Turner, he said finally, his voice a notch lower. I know the name. He saved more than a few men in Afghanistan. Matthew let out a slow breath. Yes. And tonight, he walked out into the rain with no place to go. Another pause, then Scott's voice turned firm. Send me the address. I'll be there in 15 minutes. The call ended before Matthew could say another word. He lowered the phone to the table, his fingers trembling just slightly. He felt the weight of what he'd done, of what he'd set in motion. But he also felt something else, relief. He looked out the window, the neon glow of Harborview's sign flickering in the rain. For a moment, his thoughts drifted backward to another stormy night. Nearly a year ago, it had been late, the roads slick with ice, and he'd been driving home after a long shift. His car had skidded on a patch of black ice, spinning into the ditch. The engine had died, and the cold had seeped into his bones faster than he could fight it. He'd sat there, shivering, the world a blur of white and darkness. And then headlights. A pickup truck pulled over, tires crunching through the snow. Jacob Turner had climbed out, his breath fogging in the icy air. He hadn't asked questions, hadn't hesitated. He just wrenched open the passenger door and helped Matthew out, his hands steady and warm despite the cold. Matthew remembered that night like it was yesterday. Jacob hadn't said much, only, "You're safe now. Let's get you home." And he had. He had driven Matthew back through the storm. Riley curled up on the seat between them, the dog's calm presence a balm against the night. That memory burned in Matthew's chest now, as real as the rain still lashing the windows of the diner. He shook his head, pulling himself back to the present. Scott was on his way. The thought brought a measure of comfort, though his mind still whirled with questions. Would it be enough? Would the manager at Harborview understand? Or would this turn into something bigger than any of them had planned outside? The rain kept falling. Matthew's eyes drifted to the empty booth where Jacob had sat, the seat still damp from his coat. Riley's outlined head resting on those big, loyal paws seemed to linger in Matthew's memory, even though the dog was gone. Cassie came by, her eyes soft but uncertain. "Can I get you anything else?" "Sir," she asked. Matthew managed a small smile. "No, thank you," he said gently. "I'm just waiting for someone." She nodded, her shoulders relaxing a little. "All right, let me know if you change your mind." She moved on, leaving Matthew alone with the sound of rain and the weight of what was to come. Minutes stretched like hours, the ticking clock on the wall marking time in slow, measured beats. Matthew's heart beat in time with it, each thump a reminder of the promise he'd made when he dialed that number. He had seen something tonight, something he couldn't unsee, and he wasn't going to let it stand. He thought of Jacob's calm voice as he explained the law, of the way his shoulders straightened even as he accepted the manager's final word. There had been no anger, no bitterness, just a quiet acceptance, the kind that cut deeper than any outburst ever could. Matthew felt a flicker of shame for how easily some people turned away, how quickly they forgot what men like Jacob had done. The minutes slipped by, and the diner door stayed closed. Matthew checked the time again. 10 minutes had passed since he'd called Scott. Outside, the street was empty, except for the steady glow of passing headlights and the dull gleam of rain-slick pavement. Harborview's neon sign buzzed softly, its glow reflecting off the puddles that pooled at the curb. He wondered what Jacob was doing now, if he'd found shelter, or if he was still out there, head down against the storm. Matthew swallowed hard, his chest tightening at the thought. He wouldn't let that be the end of it. Not tonight. He wiped a hand across his mouth, breathing deep and slow. The diner around him felt warm, almost too warm. It smelled of coffee and fried food, of cinnamon from the pies cooling in the display case, but none of it touched him. His mind was fixed on the wet night beyond those steamed-up windows. Then, his phone buzzed. A text from Scott. "I'm almost there. Be ready." Matthew exhaled, a shaky relief flooding through him. He leaned back in the booth, feeling the hard edge of the seat pressing into his shoulder blades. The world felt smaller now, more immediate. Outside, the rain seemed to fall harder, a drum beat against the glass that matched the thud of his heart. He watched the street through the window, waiting. The headlights of a dark SUV turned the corner, gliding silently to the curb. The brake lights flared red, and the door opened. Matthew didn't need to see the face of the man stepping out to know who it was. The straight shoulders, the calm, deliberate movements. It was Scott. It could be no one else. Matthew felt a surge of something close to hope. He rose slowly, his hands braced against the table, and moved to meet the man he knew would understand what tonight meant. The night wasn't over yet, not for Jacob Turner, and not for anyone who still believed that dignity deserved to be honored, even in the quiet corners of a rainy city. The sound of engines cut through the night air, low and deliberate, breaking the steady rhythm of the rain. Matthew stood near the window, watching as a convoy of black SUVs and military trucks pulled up along the curb outside Harborview Diner. The vehicles glistened under the streetlights, their polished surfaces reflecting the storm's fury. The diner fell into a hush, the clink of cutlery and low murmur of conversation fading to nothing. Cassie paused at the coffee station, her hand hovering above a stack of mugs, eyes wide. Even Jeff, the manager, stood frozen near the cash register, his face pale and tight. The door to the diner swung open with a quiet authority that made everyone turn. Colonel Scott Walters stepped inside, the weight of his presence filling the room before he spoke a single word. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat, darkening the polished brass on his shoulders. He paused in the doorway, his gaze sweeping across the booths, the crowded counter, and finally settling on Matthew. Matthew gave a small nod, his throat tight with relief and something more, something like pride. Scott's expression was calm, but his eyes held a promise that no one could mistake. He stepped forward, his boots silent on the slick floor, and the air seemed to shift around him. Conversation stopped completely. Even the soft hum of the jukebox felt muffled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Scott's voice was quiet but carried effortlessly across the room. "Where is he?" he asked, his tone measured, each word clear as glass. Matthew gestured toward the empty booth by the window, where a single napkin still lay folded beside a cold cup of coffee. "He left," Matthew said, his voice low, "but he shouldn't have had to." Scott nodded once, then turned his attention to Jeff, who took an uneasy step back. "Are you the manager here?" Scott asked, his tone polite but leaving no room for evasion. Jeff swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Yep, sir," he said, his voice tight. "I'm the manager." Scott took a slow breath, his shoulders rising and falling with a soldier's calm. "Then you'll understand when I say this," he said. "Jacob Turner is not just a customer. He is a veteran who has given more to this country than most people will ever know." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. Jeff opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Around the diner, heads turned, eyes wide and unblinking. No one moved. Scott took another step forward, his boots now just inches from Jeff's polished shoes. "The dog he walks with is not a pet," he continued, his voice softer now, but somehow even stronger. "That dog is a service animal, trained to guide him through the things he carries, things that you and I will never have to shoulder." Jeff's face flushed red, his hands trembling at his sides. I didn't know," he stammered. "I thought he needed papers, some kind of proof." His voice trailed off. the excuses dying in the air as Scott's steady gaze held him there. You didn't need proof, Scott said firmly. You needed to remember what respect looks like. He paused, letting the silence stretch around them like a wall. Jacob Turner walked out of this diner tonight because you forgot that some debts aren't paid with money. They're paid with the way we look at a man who's given more than he ever asked in return. The room was so still that Matthew could hear the faint hiss of the coffee machine behind the counter. Jeff's shoulders slumped, his eyes darting away from Scott's steady stare. I'm sorry, he whispered. I didn't mean any disrespect. Scott nodded slowly, his face unreadable. Intentions don't matter, he said quietly. Actions do. He lifted his chin, his voice rising just enough to reach every corner of the diner. A place that doesn't honor a man like Jacob Turner doesn't honor any of us who've worn this uniform. A ripple of understanding moved through the crowd. A man at the counter straightened in his seat, his hand going still around a half-finished cup of coffee. An older woman near the window wiped at her eyes with a napkin, her lips pressed together. Matthew felt his heart swell with something he couldn't name. Scott's gaze softened, and he turned back to Jeff, who stood silent, his shoulders drooping. You will find him, Scott said gently. You will bring him back here, and you will show him that this place, this town, still knows what gratitude means. Jeff nodded quickly, his face pale. Yeah, sir, he said. I'll make it right. I promise. The door swung open again, and through the rain, Jacob Turner appeared. He stood just inside the threshold, his coat dripping. Riley pressed close against his leg. The dog's head was up, ears forward, eyes calm and watchful. Jacob's face was unreadable, but his eyes met Scott's with a flicker of surprise. Scott stepped forward, one hand outstretched. Jacob, he said, his voice warm and steady. Come in. You've earned a seat here, and more. Jacob hesitated, his hand tightening around Riley's leash. Then he stepped forward, his boots leaving wet prints on the worn floor. The quiet dignity in his posture never wavered, even as the weight of 100 silent eyes settled on him. Scott reached out, resting a hand on Jacob's shoulder. The gesture was small, but in the silence of the diner, it felt like everything. Matthew watched as Jacob's shoulders straightened, the lines of exhaustion easing just a little. Riley pressed closer to his leg, tail thumping once against the floor. Jeff moved forward, his face flushed with shame. Mr. Turner, he said, his voice unsteady. I'm sorry, I didn't understand. I'll make it right. Please, let me get you something warm on the house. Jacob's expression softened, though he said nothing. Instead, he gave a small nod. The kind of nod that spoke of battles fought and survived, of burdens carried with quiet strength. He guided Riley to the booth by the window, settling into the seat he had left behind. The dog curled up at his feet, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. Scott sat beside him, his uniform dark and sharp against the warm light of the diner. Matthew moved to join them, sliding into the booth across from Jacob. For a moment, no one spoke. The room around them seemed to exhale, the tension easing in small, quiet breaths. Cassie appeared with a fresh cup of coffee, her hands steady now. She set it down gently in front of Jacob, her eyes meeting his for a fleeting second. Welcome back, sir, she said softly. Jacob gave her a faint smile, a small flicker of gratitude in the calm lines of his face. Scott turned to Jeff, his voice quiet but firm. Let this be a lesson, he said. Respect isn't given because someone demands it. It's given because it's earned, and because it's right. Jeff nodded quickly, his shoulders still tight but his eyes clearer than they had been when the night began. The diner settled back into its gentle rhythm. The clink of cutlery returned, the low murmur of conversation weaving back through the warm air. Outside, the rain still fell, but inside, the glow of the neon sign and the soft light of the diner felt like a promise. In that small booth, 3 men sat together, bound not by duty, but by a quiet understanding that some things are worth standing up for. And in the hush that followed, there was no need for words, just the soft sigh of the rain and the steady heartbeat of a place that had learned, at last, what it meant to honor those who had given so much. Jacob sat quietly at the booth, his hands wrapped around the warm coffee mug. Riley rested beneath the table, his head tucked between his paws, tail flicking once at the soft sound of voices around him. The dog's calm eyes scanned the room with a steady patience, as if he understood that tonight was different. Matthew leaned back in his seat, his shoulders finally relaxing. He watched Jacob carefully, noting the way the lines on his face seemed to soften in the diner's gentle light. The rain outside tapped a quiet rhythm against the window, a steady reminder that even the coldest nights held pockets of warmth. Colonel Scott sat across from Jacob, his uniform neat, every crease crisp. But in that moment, it was the easy tilt of his head, the way he held Jacob's gaze, that spoke more than any medals on his chest. "This meal," he said quietly, "isn't charity, it's respect." Jeff approached the table with a plate balanced carefully in his hands. His eyes met Jacob's, a flicker of apology and something more, something like understanding. "I hope you'll accept this," he said, his voice a shade above a whisper. "On the house, and on behalf of all of us. Thank you." Jacob's lips curved into a faint smile, the kind that didn't need to be big to be real. He didn't say much, he never had to. Instead, he gave a simple nod, one that carried the weight of every quiet debt he'd paid without asking for anything back. The scent of warm bread and roasted vegetables rose from the plate, filling the small space with a comfort that was more than food. Cassie appeared a moment later with fresh coffee for everyone, her eyes bright but solemn. She placed the mugs down carefully, her hands steady even as her breath caught in her throat. "If there's anything else you need, just let us know," she said softly. Jacob looked up, meeting her eyes with a quiet gratitude that said enough. The booth fell into an easy hush, a space held by the simple act of sharing a meal. Outside, the rain streaked down the windows, each drop a silvery line against the glow of the diner's sign. The world beyond was cold and wet, but in here, it was warm, soft light bouncing off the chrome edges of the counter, the gentle hum of the old jukebox in the background. No one spoke much. There was no need. Between bites of food and the slow sips of hot coffee, there was a peace that didn't need to be named. It lived in the weight of the air, in the small nods and the way Matthew's shoulders eased as he leaned forward to listen to the steady murmur of Scott's voice. Jacob cut into the roast carefully, his hands steady, each movement deliberate. Riley's ears twitched at the sound of the fork tapping the plate, but he didn't move from his spot. His tail thumped lightly once, a reminder that he was there, always there in the spaces between silence and memory. Outside, the wind gusted, rattling the door just slightly. The neon sign of Harborview Diner glowed bright and steady, its letters casting warm reflections on the wet pavement. For a moment, it was as if the whole world had shrunk to the small circle of that booth, 3 men, a dog, and the promise that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could stretch farther than any storm. After a while, Jeff returned, his hands in his pockets, eyes lowered respectfully. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice gruff but honest, "about how we treat people like Jacob, about how we should have known better." His words hung there, met by the soft clink of a spoon in a coffee cup. He took a breath and looked at Jacob squarely. "Tomorrow morning," he said, his voice steady now, "I'm putting up a new sign. It'll say, 'Service dogs welcome, honoring our veterans,' because no one should have to explain what they've already earned." Jacob looked up, his eyes warm and unwavering. He didn't need to say thank you. His quiet nod was enough. Matthew felt his chest tighten with something that wasn't sorrow or regret. It was pride, simple and clear. Colonel Scott reached across the table, his hand resting lightly on Jacob's shoulder. You shouldn't have to fight for this kind of respect, he said. His voice was low, but it carried through the quiet room. But I'll keep fighting for you, and for every man who's ever stood where you did. Jacob didn't answer right away. He took another sip of his coffee, the steam curling around his fingers like a small promise of warmth. Then he looked at Scott, his voice low and even. That's all any of us can ask for, he said. For a moment, the booth was silent, each man lost in his own thoughts. Then Riley lifted his head, his ears perking up, tail giving a slow, contented wag. It was as if he knew that something important had shifted in the room, something that couldn't be undone. The night wore on, the diner's hum steady and comforting. Outside, the rain slowed to a gentle drizzle, the streetlights flickering in the damp air. Cassie moved between the booths, her steps soft, her face calm, and in the booth by the window, three men shared a quiet meal that was more than food. It was an acknowledgement, a promise kept in the glow of warm lights in the hush of late hours. Eventually, Matthew leaned back, his coffee growing cold in his hands. He looked at Jacob, at the quiet strength in the set of his shoulders, and he knew that this was a night he would remember for the rest of his life. Not for the rain or the tension that had filled the diner when the doors had opened, but for what had come after, for the way respect had been restored in the simplest, most powerful way. As the last plates were cleared and the final refills of coffee poured, Jeff came by one more time. His hands were still trembling, just a little, but his eyes were steady. Thank you for coming back, he said to Jacob, his voice soft. You shouldn't have had to, but I'm glad you did. Jacob looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small smile, the kind that lived in the corners of his eyes. We all have to stand somewhere, he said. This was mine tonight, outside. The neon sign glowed a little brighter, as if the night itself had taken a breath and settled into calm. And in the small space of that booth, the last echoes of the storm faded into the hush of gratitude. Riley shifted under the table, his tail curling around Jacob's boots. Head lifted. His dark eyes seemed to hold the whole moment, the warmth, the quiet pride, the simple truth that some things didn't need to be spoken to be understood. And in that moment, with the last drops of rain whispering against the glass, it felt like the whole world had paused to remember what mattered most. A new sign would hang in the window tomorrow. A promise in bold letters, service dogs welcome, honoring our veterans. Jacob wouldn't need to prove himself here again. He had already done enough. The night wound down softly, conversations quieting, the last cups of coffee sipped with reverence, and as Jacob reached down to scratch Riley behind the ears, the dog leaned into the touch, his tail thumping once in steady, quiet joy. For a moment, there was only that man and dog, the hush of a diner in the rain, and the knowledge that some battles were won, not with weapons, but with kindness and the steady dignity of those who had already given everything they could. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes, that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.